Boston, 1847. A storm builds over Beacon Hill, dark clouds curling around the city's crooked spires like smoke from a forbidden fire. Inside a modest brick boarding house, a woman who had lived her whole life in chains is about to do something unthinkable. For 23 years, she had obeyed every command from every white voice that spoke her name. But tonight, she will disobey. She will look a white man in the eyes, an attorney with the power to drag her back to Virginia, and she will say a single impossible word. No, the air freezes. The universe shifts. A silence like judgment fills the room. Because that word, spoken by a woman born into silence, wasn't just defiance. It was a weapon, a spell, a moment that cracked the illusion of ownership itself. What happened next would expose a hidden network of forged freedom papers, powerful Boston families financing a secret rebellion against Southern money, and a conspiracy that threatened to destroy both slave and master alike. Her name was Margaret Thornnehill. And what she unleashed in that moment would reveal that even in the so-called a free North, freedom itself was an illusion carefully managed by men who called themselves saviors. Margaret hadn't been born free. She was born Sarah, no surname, on the dying soil of Hartwick Plantation, Virginia in 1823. The plantation was collapsing, its tobacco fields exhausted, its white masters desperate. They sold people like livestock to keep the estate afloat. Her husband, Peter, was next in line. And when they came for him, she vanished. 9 days under a Quaker family's floorboards, 11 more in a false-bottom wagon, 4 days in the dark hold of a fishing vessel, sailing north. No sunlight, no sound, just breath, prayer, and the crawling realization that freedom might not be what she thought. When she reached Boston, she was told she'd escaped hell. But as she walked through its gray, smoke-stained streets, men in top hats stepping past her as if she were invisible, Margaret began to sense something deeper. Freedom in the North wasn't freedom. It was permission. Conditional. Supervised. The plantation had walls of wood and iron. Boston's were built of law, money, and guilt. Beacon Hill was where the illusion took root. They said it was a safe haven, a nest of abolitionists, reformers, philosophers. But the truth, it was a marketplace for morality. Wealthy white benefactors purchased their innocence by sponsoring the salvation of black souls. And every free man or woman walking those cobbled streets was a symbol in someone else's story. Margaret found work in the attic of Mrs. Abigail Fletcher's boarding house, sewing for Boston's elite. The white women wore her stitches like badges of grace, never realizing they were touching the hands of a woman they'd have enslaved 20 years earlier. Mrs. Fletcher herself was an abolitionist, yes, but also a forger. A quiet revolutionary who crafted false freedom papers that tricked the system into acknowledging humanity it refused to see. Those documents, inked lies on stolen paper, were the only protection people like Margaret had from being dragged back south. But every forged word came at a price. 6 months' wages, whispered oaths, sleepless nights, and above them all, one law remained untouched, the Fugitive Slave Act, proof that freedom in America was never about truth, only paperwork. The cracks appeared first as whispers. Clerks at the courthouse noticed duplicate signatures. A lawyer from Virginia was asking questions. He was polite, methodical, and dangerous. His name was Edward Crane, an attorney in a property law, meaning he specialized in the ownership of human beings. But Crane wasn't a hunter. He was something worse, a builder of cases, an architect of ruin. He came north not to seize one woman, but to destroy the idea of freedom itself. Mrs. Fletcher gathered her boarders one night in the dim light of her parlor. "Someone's coming for the network," she warned. "He wants to shut down everything we've built." Margaret listened, silent, feeling the phantom weight of change she thought she'd shed forever. They all agreed to keep quiet, to show no papers, to trust no strangers. But silence in Boston was as fragile as glass. And Crane had a way of finding cracks. He was a man who understood something most Northerners didn't, that every freedom purchased with lies could be revoked by truth. 2 days later, he appeared, tall, sharp-eyed, dressed in black, a shadow of Virginia arrogance wrapped in civility. Crane entered Mrs. Fletcher's shop like a man who already owned it. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly. "I'm looking into forged manumission papers circulating through Boston. I believe they originate here." Margaret froze mid-stitch. His voice, calm, deliberate, reached into her bones like a memory. It was the voice of every man who had ever decided what her life was worth. When he asked her name, something inside her began to tremble. She opened her mouth, but Mrs. Fletcher stepped between them, her voice steady. "The women in my employ do not answer to strangers." Crane smiled faintly. "Of course," he said. "Good day." But as he turned to leave, he looked back at Margaret. His eyes said it plainly. "I will be back for you." That night, the house locked every door, every window. Reverend Hayes came in silence. They prayed. But even prayer couldn't erase the truth Margaret now felt in her chest. Freedom built on forgery is freedom built on sand. For 3 days, Crane moved through Boston like a specter. Courthouses, churches, docks. He traced signatures, bribed clerks, spoke softly to powerful men. And wherever he went, eyes followed him, not out of suspicion, but respect. Margaret realized something horrifying. Crane wasn't just an enemy. He was invited. The North didn't fear him. It welcomed him because he represented order, property, the law, and law was the one God Boston still worshipped. When he returned to the boarding house on September 14th, the sky was the color of iron. Mrs. Fletcher's hands shook as she told Margaret, "He's here for you." Upstairs, Margaret could hear his voice through the floorboards. Measured, patient, confident. The voice of a man certain that the world itself bent toward his favor. If she's truly free, he was saying, she has nothing to fear from showing her papers. But Margaret knew what fear felt like, and she could feel it now, moving through her veins like something alive. The kind of fear that makes obedience feel holy. She walked into the parlor slowly. Crane turned, and for a moment the room held two worlds, the old and the new facing each other. He began with courtesy. "Miss Thornnehill," he said. "Miss Thornnehill, your papers claim you were freed by one Thomas Thornnehill of Alexandria. Yet no such man exists in the registry. I'd like to examine your documents." His voice was smooth as poison. Mrs. Fletcher intervened. "Mr. Crane, she is under no obligation." "I wasn't speaking to you." He cut her off. "I'm speaking to her. It was a trap. Compliance meant exposure. Refusal meant rebellion." Margaret could feel 23 years of submission tightening around her throat like rope. The memory of men with whips, the smell of iron and tobacco, the command to obey. But beneath it all, something else stirred, a voice too quiet to belong to fear. She looked at Crane, looked at the expectation on his face, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. "No," she said. The room froze. Even the air seemed to recoil. That word, "no," was not language. It was treason. Crane's expression faltered, just for a breath. The performance of authority cracked. "I beg your pardon," he said quietly. Margaret's voice shook, but her eyes didn't. "I said no. You've got no right to ask." Mrs. Fletcher's hand trembled on her shoulder, half in fear, half in awe. That word had never belonged to her before. It wasn't taught to women like her. It wasn't allowed. Yet here in this narrow parlor, it became something sacred. Crane stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Do you understand what you're refusing?" "Yes," she whispered. "For the first time I do. For one long, unbearable moment, the past and the present collided. Virginia and Boston, chains and choice." Crane turned on his heel and left without another word. But his silence carried a promise. This wasn't over. What Margaret didn't know was that her defiance triggered something far larger than herself. Crane had come north not only to find forged papers, but to identify who was making them. He was working for a hidden consortium of Southern investors. Yes, but their money was coming from somewhere far stranger, Northern merchants. The same men funding abolitionist newspapers were secretly financing the slave trade through shell companies in New Orleans. The anti-slavery movement was, in part, a business war between rival elites. Margaret's single act of defiance had lit a fuse under the entire system, and Crane's true goal wasn't to destroy the forgers, it was to control them, to use the network for federal intelligence. The North and South weren't enemies, they were partners in control. Margaret's no wasn't just a rebellion against a man, it was rebellion against a machine that thrived on illusion. The same machine that still exists today. You've heard of a freedom, haven't you? The idea that if you just obey the right laws, pay the right debts, or think the right thoughts, you'll be safe. That's the lie. Freedom in every century has always been conditional, measured, managed, just like Margaret's. The system lets you speak, but never too loud. It lets you move, but only within its boundaries. And when someone finally says a no, truly no, it doesn't just threaten the system, it reveals it. If you're still watching this, I want you to comment below the phrase, "I say no to illusion." Write it twice. once for the world and once for yourself. Because that phrase marks transformation, the moment a man refuses to be a subject of invisible masters, the moment he steps into dangerous knowledge. Margaret Thornnehill's word changed her world. Yours can too. After Crane's departure, the network panicked. Some fled Boston. Others burned their papers. Mrs. Fletcher tried to move Margaret to another safe house, but it was too late. The walls were closing in. Newspapers began printing stories about a fraudulent Negro papers circulating through the North. Public opinion shifted overnight. Freedom was becoming a criminal. Crane had played his part perfectly. He didn't need to capture fugitives, he just needed to make the idea of helping them dangerous. That's how control works, not through chains, but through fear of them. And the most effective fear is moral. The fear of doing wrong while trying to do right. Margaret watched Boston turn colder, not in weather, but in spirit. The freedom houses locked their doors. Ministers spoke in riddles. And every night she dreamed of Virginia, wondering if perhaps slavery was simpler than this. At least then, the enemy wore his face openly. But Crane made one mistake. He underestimated the human soul's hunger for truth. Margaret wasn't the same woman who arrived in Boston. She had seen both sides of bondage, the whip and the law, and realized they were brothers. So she began writing letters, journals, names, a record of everyone involved in the network, not to expose them, but to preserve them. A hidden archive of courage buried beneath fiction, smuggled out in sewing kits and hymnals. Years later, those writings would be discovered by a historian at Harvard, then quietly sealed. Because what she documented wasn't just resistance. It was evidence that America's moral war had always been a performance. Abolitionists laundering guilt, planters laundering money, and the rest of us, just the audience applauding both sides. By winter, Crane vanished from Boston's record. Some say he returned to Virginia. Others whisper he joined a secretive federal bureau that tracked communication between northern abolitionists and southern financiers, a prototype of intelligence agencies yet to come. Margaret, meanwhile, disappeared from the census in 1848. Officially, she moved west. Unofficially, no one knows. But there's a legend whispered in the alleys of Beacon Hill that she lived under a new name, sewing coded messages into the hems of white women's gowns, maps of safe houses, names of traitors, symbols of resistance. The needle became her sword, every stitch a secret, every silence a warning. And somewhere in those hidden seams, she wove the truth Crane tried to bury, that no document, no law, no government ever grants freedom. It only recognizes the man or woman strong enough to seize it. Freedom is not granted, it's remembered. The act of saying no, not to a person but to a system, echoes across generations. That's why the story of Margaret Thornnehill was never taught, because it wasn't just about slavery. It was about awakening. The moment a powerless person realizes the power was never external, it was stolen and disguised as permission. The elite, then as now, thrive on dependency. They need you to believe you're free because they told you so. They need you obedient, moral, terrified of disobedience, dressed as a sin. But beneath that, they fear something, men who no longer ask for approval. Margaret wasn't educated, wealthy, or armed, yet her single word threatened an empire of illusion. Because true defiance isn't violence, it's awareness. It's awareness. Every control system, ancient or modern, relies on the same equation: obedience traded for safety. The church, the state, the market, all built on the same plantation principle: submit and you'll be protected, say no and you'll be erased. But the moment you stop begging for permission, you stop being property. You become unpredictable. That's why they fear you learning stories like this. Because history isn't about what happened, it's about what's been allowed to be remembered. Margaret Thornnehill's name was meant to be erased. But now you've heard it, and somewhere deep inside, that same ancient energy, the one that made her say no, awakens in you. So ask yourself, where have you mistaken obedience for freedom? Where do you still ask permission to exist, to speak, to resist? The world hasn't changed. It's just digitized. The overseers wear suits instead of whips. The papers are algorithms now. The system still asks for your silence and still rewards it with illusion. But once you know that truth, you can't unsee it. Once you say no, truly no, the world changes color. The air sharpens. You become something else, untouchable. This is your moment of remembering. Comment below one last time. I say no to illusion. not as a slogan, but as a declaration. No, because Margaret's voice didn't die in 1847. It's alive right now, in you, in me, in every man who refuses to kneel before invisible masters, and that is the most dangerous kind of freedom there is.